The red lights flashed across the walls of Epsilon Research Station like angry eyes in the darkness. Dr. Maya Rodriguez pressed her back against the cold metal door of Laboratory 7, her heart beating so fast she could hear it echo in her ears. Something had gone terribly wrong with her research, and now the entire station was paying the price. 3 hours ago, everything had been normal. Maya was studying the alien parasites they had discovered on the dead world of Kepler 442b, trying to understand how they survived in such harsh conditions. The creatures were small, no bigger than her thumb, but they moved in ways that defied everything she knew about biology. They seemed to communicate with each other without making any sound, working together like parts of a single mind. She had been so careful with the containment protocols. The parasites were kept in sealed chambers, with triple-layered barriers monitored by sensors that would alert her to any change in their behavior. But when she returned from lunch, she found the containment units cracked open like broken eggs, and the parasites were gone. The first scream came from the ventilation shaft above her laboratory, then another from the corridor outside. Maya had sealed herself in the lab and activated the emergency beacon, but by then it was too late. The parasites had found their way into the station's air system, and they were looking for host. Captain Blake Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom system, filled with panic and authority. All personnel report to evacuation stations. Immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. We have a code black contamination event. All ships prepare for immediate departure. Maya tried to reach the main corridor, but the automated blast door had sealed shut when the contamination alarm triggered. She was trapped in the research section with no way to reach the evacuation points. Her communication device had been damaged when she dropped it during the initial panic, leaving her cut off from the rest of the station. Through the small window in her laboratory door, she could see the corridor beyond. Emergency lights cast long shadows on the walls, and she could hear strange scratching sounds coming from the ventilation shafts. The sounds were getting closer. Meanwhile, 3 levels above, Sergeant Jake Martinez was helping evacuate civilian researchers from the upper decks. His job was simple: make sure everyone got to the transport ship safely. Jake had been assigned to Epsilon Station only 2 weeks ago, part of a routine security detail to protect the research teams working on the frontier. He moved through the evacuation checklist with military precision, counting heads and checking names off his tablet. The transport ships were filling up quickly as frightened scientists and technicians crowded aboard, carrying whatever personal belongings they could grab in their rush to escape. "Martinez, get your people moving," Captain Morrison shouted over the chaos. "We need to be gone in 10 minutes. The contamination is spreading faster than our models predicted." Jake nodded and continued his count, but something felt wrong. He had been responsible for 42 civilian researchers, but his count only showed 41. Someone was missing. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said, checking his tablet again. "Maya Rodriguez from the Xenobiology lab. Has anyone seen her?" The other researchers shook their heads, too panicked to remember who was where. Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The research levels were in the contaminated zone, sealed off by the emergency protocols. If Dr. Rodriguez was still down there, she was trapped. "Martinez, move your ass," Morrison yelled from the transport ship's airlock. "We're leaving now." Jake looked at his tablet one more time, then at the sealed blast door that led to the research levels. Standing orders were clear. In a contamination event, no one goes back into the sealed zones. The risk of infection was too high, and the safety of the many outweighed the safety of the few. But Jake had never been good at following orders that left people behind. Down in Laboratory 7, Maya watched through her window as shapes moved in the corridor. They looked human at first glance, but they moved wrong. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their arms hanging loose at their sides. These had been her colleagues just hours ago, but now something else was controlling them. The parasites had found their perfect hosts in humans. They attached themselves to the nervous system, taking control of motor functions while leaving enough of the original personality intact to make the infected seem almost normal. Almost, but not quite. Dr. Peterson from the physics lab shuffled past her window, his face blank and his eyes focused on something she could not see. Behind him came Lisa Chun from communications, her uniform torn and stained with something dark. They moved together without speaking, like dancers following the same silent music. Maya pressed herself further against the door, trying to make no sound. The infected seemed to hunt by movement and sound, but they had not noticed her yet. She needed to stay quiet and wait for rescue, but as the minutes passed, she began to wonder if rescue was coming at all. The transport ship's engines rumbled through the station's hull as they prepared to leave. Maya could feel the vibrations in the metal walls around her. Soon, she would be alone with the infected crew, trapped in a floating tomb with no way out. Jake made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. As the last transport ship began to seal its airlock, he stepped backward into the shadows of the loading bay. Captain Morrison was shouting orders, counting down the final seconds before departure. But Jake was already moving toward the maintenance shaft that led to the research levels. His military training kicked in as he crawled through the narrow shaft, his rifle ready and his senses alert for any sign of the infected. The shaft was dark and cramped, filled with the humming of machinery and the distant sounds of the creatures moving through the station below. Jake had no idea what he would find when he reached the research levels. He did not know if Dr. Rodriguez was still alive or if she had already been taken by the parasites. All he knew was that he could not leave someone behind, not when there was still a chance to save them. Behind him, the transport ships detached from Epsilon Station and began their journey back to safe harbor. Jake was now alone on a station full of infected crew members, armed with limited ammunition and no backup plan, but he had made his choice and he would see it through to the end. Jake dropped silently from the maintenance shaft into the research level corridor. The emergency lights cast everything in a sick red glow, and the air felt thick and wrong. He could smell something metallic and sweet like copper mixed with rotting fruit. His rifle was loaded and ready, but he hoped he would not have to use it on people who had once been his responsibility to protect. The corridor stretched ahead of him in both directions, lined with laboratory doors and observation windows. Most of the lights in the labs were dark, but he could see movement in some of them. Slow, deliberate movement that made his skin crawl. Jake checked his tablet for Dr. Rodriguez's lab assignment. Laboratory 7 was 3 doors down on the left. He moved carefully along the wall, his boots making no sound on the metal floor. Every shadow could hide one of the infected, and every sound could bring them running. As he passed Laboratory 4, he saw Dr. Williams standing motionless in the center of the room. Jake had shared coffee with Williams just yesterday morning, talking about the man's daughter who was starting college back on Earth. Now Williams stood perfectly still, his head tilted to one side, waiting for something Jake could not understand. Williams turned slowly toward the window, and Jake saw his eyes. They were still brown, still human, but there was something else behind them now, something that watched and calculated and hungered. Williams looked directly at Jake for a long moment, then turned away as if he had seen nothing at all. Jake forced himself to keep moving. The infected seemed to ignore him as long as he stayed quiet and moved slowly. Maybe they were programmed to hunt only active threats, or maybe they were saving their energy for something bigger. Either way, he was grateful for the reprieve. Laboratory 7's door was sealed tight, but Jake could see a faint light coming from under the crack. Someone was inside, and they were still using power. That was a good sign. Dead people did not need lights. He tapped softly on the door with his knuckle, 3 short sounds followed by 2 long ones. It was not any official code, just something that sounded human and deliberate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he heard a voice from inside, barely a whisper. "Who is it?" "Sergeant Jake Martinez, Station Security," he whispered back. "Are you Dr. Rodriguez?" There was a long pause, then the sound of something heavy being moved away from the door. The lock cycled through its sequence and the door opened just wide, enough for Jake to see a woman's face peering out at him. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her lab coat was stained with something that might have been coffee or might have been blood. "You came back," Maya said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Everyone left." "I heard the ships leaving hours ago." "Not everyone," Jake said. "Can I come in?" "It's not safe out here." Maya stepped back and led him into the laboratory. The room was small and cramped, filled with scientific equipment that hummed and beeped softly. Computer screens showed data streams that meant nothing to Jake, but everything to the woman who had been studying the creatures that were now hunting them both. Maya had barricaded the door with a heavy equipment cabinet and covered the window with black plastic sheeting. Smart thinking. She had also gathered supplies, water bottles, protein bars, and a first aid kit. She was planning for a long wait. "What happened to your communication device?" Jake asked, noticing the broken pieces on one of the lab tables. "Dropped it when everything went crazy," Maya said. "I was so stupid. I thought the containment was perfect, but these things are smarter than I gave them credit for. They worked together to break out like they had a plan." Jake examined the broken communicator. The screen was cracked, but the transmitter might still work if they could find the right parts. "Can you tell me what we're dealing with? How dangerous are these parasites?" Maya pulled up a file on her computer screen. It showed microscopic images of the alien organisms, tiny worm-like creatures with what looked like neural tendrils. They attach to the human nervous system and take over motor control. The host is still conscious, still aware, but they can't control their own body anymore. So the people out there, they're still alive inside their own heads? As far as I can tell, yes. The parasite needs the brain intact to access memories and learned behaviors. That's what makes them such perfect infiltrators. They look and act human because they're wearing human bodies like suits. Jake felt sick. The idea of being trapped inside his own body, watching helplessly as something else used his hands and voice, was worse than death. Is there a way to remove them? "I don't know yet. I was just starting to understand their biology when they escaped, but I have been working on something that might help." Maya turned to another computer and pulled up a different set of data. "They communicate through electromagnetic pulses, very low frequency. I've been modifying some of the lab equipment to generate interference signals." She showed him a device that looked like a cross between a radio and a welding torch. Wires and circuit boards were held together with tape and hope, but the display screen showed a steady pulse pattern. "This might disrupt their coordination," Maya said. "Make them confused or slow them down." "I tested it on some tissue samples and it seemed to work, but I haven't tried it on a living host yet." Jake nodded. It was better than nothing. "We need to get to the main computer core and download your research data. If we can get that information to the fleet, maybe they can develop a real cure." "The core is in the most infected part of the station," Maya said. "I've been monitoring the internal sensors. There are dozens of them between here and there, maybe more. Then we'll have to be smart about it." "Can you make more of these devices?" Maya looked at her improvised weapon, then at the scattered parts around her lab. "Maybe 2 more, if I can find the right components." "But Jake, why did you come back?" "For me? You don't even know me." Jake checked his rifle and made sure his armor seals were tight. "Because that's what humans do. We don't leave people behind, not when there's still a chance to save them." Maya stared at him for a moment, as if she was seeing him for the first time. Then she nodded and began gathering parts for more electromagnetic disruptors. "Then let's get to work. We have a lot to do before we can leave this room." Maya finished building the 3rd electromagnetic disruptor just as the lights in her laboratory flickered and went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in the familiar red glow, but Jake knew this was not a good sign. The infected were learning to use the station's systems against them. "They're getting smarter," Maya whispered, checking her devices one final time. "The parasites are accessing their host's technical knowledge. They know how to manipulate the power grid." Jake nodded grimly. He had noticed the same thing during his journey through the corridors. The infected moved with more purpose now, positioning themselves at strategic points and working together in ways that suggested planning rather than instinct. How long until they figure out we're in here? Not long. The life support sensors will show them where the air is being used. We need to move now while we still have the advantage of surprise. Jake shouldered his rifle and clipped one of Maya's devices to his belt. The electromagnetic disruptor was heavier than it looked, but if it could buy them even a few seconds of confusion, it might save their lives. What's the fastest route to the computer core? Maya pulled up a station schematic on her tablet. We can take the maintenance tunnels for most of the way, but we'll have to cross the main hub to reach the core chamber. That's where most of the infected are gathering. Why are they gathering there? I think they're trying to access the communication array. If they can contact their homeworld, they could call for reinforcements or share what they've learned about human biology. The thought of an entire alien fleet armed with knowledge about human weaknesses made Jake's blood run cold. They were not just fighting for their own survival anymore. They were fighting for the survival of their entire species. Maya sealed her research data onto a portable drive and tucked it safely into her lab coat pocket. Everything she had learned about the parasites was now compressed into a device smaller than her thumb. If they could get that information to the human fleet, it might be the key to stopping the invasion before it started. They left the safety of Laboratory 7 and entered the dark corridor beyond. The maintenance tunnel entrance was 50 meters away, past 3 other laboratories and around a corner. It might as well have been 50 kilometers. Jake took point, his rifle ready and his senses alert for any movement. Maya followed close behind, carrying her tablet and the spare disruptors. They moved slowly and quietly, trying to blend into the shadows cast by the emergency lighting. The first laboratory they passed was empty, its equipment scattered and broken. The second showed signs of a struggle, with overturned tables and dark stains on the floor. But the third laboratory stopped them both in their tracks. Through the observation window, they could see at least a dozen infected crew members standing in perfect formation. They were not moving, not breathing, just standing there like soldiers, at attention. Their eyes were open but unfocused, as if they were listening to something only they could hear. It's like they're receiving orders, Maya breathed, barely audible even to Jake. As if responding to her words, all 12 infected turned their heads toward the window in perfect unison. Their eyes focused on Jake and Maya with an intelligence that was definitely not human. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the infected began walking toward the laboratory door. Run, Jake said, grabbing Maya's hand and pulling her toward the maintenance tunnel. Behind them, they could hear the laboratory door sliding open and the sound of footsteps in the corridor. They reached the tunnel entrance. Just as the first infected rounded the corner, Jake yanked open the access hatch and pushed Maya inside, then followed her into the narrow space. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees through the darkness. "They're following us," Maya gasped, looking back toward the entrance. "I can hear them in the tunnel?" Jake could hear them too, the sound of bodies scraping against metal as the infected tried to follow them through the narrow space. But the parasites had made their hosts clumsy, and the tunnel was too small for them to move quickly. It was buying Jake and Maya precious time. They crawled through the maintenance system for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The tunnel branched and twisted through the station's infrastructure, past power conduits and water recycling pipes. Jake navigated by memory and instinct, trying to remember the station blueprints he had studied during his security briefing. Finally, they reached a junction where the tunnel opened into a larger service area. Jake helped Maya down from the tunnel entrance, and they found themselves in a room filled with humming machinery and blinking status lights. They were in the heart of the station's life support system. "Where are we?" Maya asked, catching her breath. Jake checked his position against his mental map of the station. "About halfway to the computer core. But we'll have to cross the main hub from here. There's no other way." Maya activated her tablet and scanned the local network. What she saw made her face go pale. "Jake, look at this. The infected aren't just gathering randomly. They're creating some kind of network. Each group is positioned at a critical system node. The tablet showed a diagram of the station with red dots marking infected positions. They were distributed throughout the structure in a pattern that looked almost like a neural network, with the computer core at the center. They're turning the entire station into a single organism, Maya continued, using the infected crew as nodes in a larger intelligence. That's why they're getting smarter. They're sharing information instantaneously across the entire network. Jake studied the pattern, looking for weaknesses. Can your disruptors interfere with their network? Maybe, but only locally. We'd need something much more powerful to disrupt the entire system. Maya's eyes lit up with an idea. Wait, the station's main communication array generates massive electromagnetic pulses when it transmits. If I could modify the transmission frequency and increase the power output, you could scramble their entire network, Jake finished. Exactly. But the communication controls are in the computer core, right in the center of their network. Getting there will be like walking into a spider's web. Jake checked his ammunition count and tightened his grip on the electromagnetic disruptor. Then we'd better be ready to fight our way through. The main hub of Epsilon Station stretched out before Jake and Maya like a nightmare brought to life. The massive circular chamber that had once been the heart of the research facility was now filled with infected crew members standing in perfect formation. They faced the central computer core like worshippers at an altar, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle, their eyes focused on something beyond human understanding. There must be 60 of them, Maya whispered, crouching beside Jake at the entrance to the hub. How are we going to get through all of them? Jake studied the scene through his rifle scope. The infected were positioned in concentric circles around the computer core, creating layers of defense that would be impossible to fight through with conventional weapons. But he noticed something that gave him hope. They were all facing inward, toward the core, leaving gaps in their formation that a careful person might exploit. They're not guarding against intruders, Jake realized. They're focused on something else entirely. Look at their positioning. Maya followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The infected crew members were arranged like components in a massive circuit, with clear pathways between them that pulsed with electromagnetic energy. Her tablet picked up the signals, showing waves of data flowing between the infected in patterns that reminded her of neural activity. They're not just sharing information, Maya said, her scientific mind racing to understand what she was seeing. They're processing it. The entire network is working like a single giant brain, and the computer core is providing the processing power. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. If the aliens could use human technology to enhance their own intelligence, there was no telling what they might accomplish. They had to stop this before the network reached critical mass. Can you disrupt them with your devices? Jake asked. Maybe, but not all of them at once. The electromagnetic disruptors have limited range, and the moment I activate one, the whole network will know where we are? Jake checked his ammunition one more time. He had 2 full magazines for his rifle and a handful of grenades. Against 60 infected crew members, it was not nearly enough for a direct assault. They would have to be smarter than that. What if we create a diversion? Jake suggested. Draw some of them away from the core while you work on accessing the communication array? Maya nodded slowly. It might work, but you'd be facing dozens of them alone. And once they know you're here, they'll adapt their tactics to counter everything you try. Then I'll have to stay one step ahead of them. Jake smiled grimly. Good thing I've always been better at improvising than following the manual. They spent the next 10 minutes planning their assault. Maya would use the maintenance tunnels to approach the computer core from below, while Jake created a distraction on the opposite side of the hub. When Maya signaled that she was in position, Jake would begin his attack, drawing the infected away from the core and giving her the time she needed to modify the communication array. Jake watched Maya disappear into the tunnel system, then made his way around the hub to his starting position. Through the observation windows, he could see the infected crew still standing in their perfect formation, processing data and sharing intelligence across their network. In a few minutes, He was going to shatter that peaceful scene with bullets and explosions. He activated his communication device and whispered into it, even though he knew Maya could not respond without revealing her position. "I'm in position. Beginning attack in 60 seconds. Stay safe down there." Jake pulled the pin from his first grenade and counted down the seconds. When he reached 0, he kicked open the access door and hurled the explosive device into the center of the hub. The grenade bounced twice before detonating in a brilliant flash of light and sound. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Every infected crew member in the hub turned toward Jake's position with mechanical precision, their eyes burning with alien intelligence. They began moving toward him in waves, no longer the shambling creatures they had been before. The network had analyzed his tactics and was already adapting to counter them. Jake opened fire with his rifle, picking off the closest infected with carefully aimed shots. Each bullet found its target, dropping the host body and hopefully freeing the human mind trapped inside. But for every infected he stopped, 2 more took their place. The network was learning from each encounter, studying his movements and predicting his next action. Jake found himself forced to constantly change tactics, using his military training in human unpredictability to stay ahead of their analysis. He rolled behind a support pillar as a group of infected tried to flank him, then popped up to fire. At a different angle, a grenade cleared a cluster of them from his path, but more kept coming. They moved with purpose now, coordinating their attacks and using the hub's architecture to their advantage. Meanwhile, Maya had reached the computer core through the maintenance system. The core chamber was smaller than she had expected, dominated by a massive server array that hummed with processing power. Fiber optic cables snaked across the floor like glowing veins, carrying data between the infected network and the stations. Systems. Maya plugged her tablet into the core's main interface and began working her way through the security protocols. The network had changed all the access codes, but her scientific clearance still gave her backdoor entry to some systems. She found the communication array controls and began modifying the transmission frequency. Above her, she could hear the sounds of Jake's battle echoing through the hub. Gunfire and explosions mixed with the inhuman sounds of the infected as they pressed their attack. Maya forced herself to focus on her work, knowing that Jake was counting on her to complete the mission. The modified communication array would generate an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to disrupt the entire network, but it would also destroy every electronic system on the station, including life support, artificial gravity, and the escape pods. They would have to time their escape perfectly, or they would die along with the infected. Maya finished her modifications and looked up at the hub above. Jake was still fighting, but she could see that he was being overwhelmed. It was time to end this. She activated the communication array and watched as power levels spiked across every system on the station. The electromagnetic pulse built slowly. At first, then faster as the array focused its energy. In 30 seconds, every parasite on Epsilon Station would be fried by the pulse. Maya grabbed her tablet and ran for the maintenance tunnel that would take her back to Jake. They had 30 seconds to reach the escape pods, and the station was about to become a very dangerous place to be. Jake and Maya ran through the collapsing station as the self-destruct countdown echoed from speakers in the walls. The numbers fell like hammer blows. 30 seconds, 29, 28. The corridor shook with each explosion as the station tore itself apart around them. Behind them, the infected crew stumbled and fell as Maya's electromagnetic pulse disrupted their network. Without their shared intelligence, they moved like drunk people, confused and unsteady. But Jake knew the effect would not last long. The parasites were already adapting, finding new ways to communicate. "There!" Maya shouted over the noise, pointing to a blast door marked with bright yellow warning signs. "The escape pod bay is through that door." Jake slammed his fist on the door control, but nothing happened. The display showed red letters. That made his heart sink. Manual override required. The door was sealed by the emergency protocols, and it would take time they did not have to break through. "Stand back," Jake said, pulling an explosive charge from his belt. It was his last one, saved for exactly this kind of emergency. He placed it against the door lock and activated the timer. The explosion blew the door open, just as the countdown reached 15 seconds. Through the smoke and debris they could see the escape pod bay beyond. But standing between them and safety was Captain Blake Morrison. Morrison looked almost human at first glance, but Jake could see the telltale signs of infection in his tilted head and the way his arms hung loose at his sides. The parasite had taken control of the captain's body, but something else was different. Morrison's eyes showed recognition when he saw Jake. "Sergeant Martinez," Morrison said, his voice thick and strange. "You should have left with the others. Captain, are you still in there?" Jake asked, keeping his rifle trained on the man who had been his commanding officer. "Part of me," Morrison replied. "The parasite lets me watch, lets me remember. It wants to understand human command structure, human loyalty." He stepped aside, clearing the path to the escape pods. "But some things it does not understand." Jake hesitated. This could be a trap, a way for the infected captain to get close enough to attack. But something in Morrison's eyes looked genuinely human, fighting against the alien presence in his mind. "Go," Morrison said, his voice growing weaker as the parasite tried to regain control. "The creature in my head does not understand why you came back for her. It thinks human loyalty is a weakness to be exploited. Prove it wrong." The countdown reached 10 seconds. Jake grabbed Maya's hand and ran for the nearest escape pod. Morrison stood guard behind them, his body rigid as he fought an internal battle against the parasite controlling his nervous system. They reached the escape pod just as the countdown hit 5 seconds. Jake shoved Maya through the hatch and followed her inside, slamming the emergency launch button as the final numbers fell to 0. The escape pod shot away from Epsilon Station like a bullet, its small engine pushing them clear of the explosion zone. Through the tiny porthole, they watched as the research station disappeared in a brilliant flash of light. The explosion was so bright it lit up the surrounding space like a miniature star. Maya was crying, her face pressed against Jake's shoulder as the reality of their survival hit her. They had made it. Against all odds, they had escaped with the cure data and prevented the aliens from learning more about human biology. "It's over," Jake said softly, holding her as the escape pod's automatic systems sent out a distress beacon. "We're safe now." But even as he said the words, Jake was already thinking about the future. The aliens who had created these parasites were still out there somewhere, and they would not give up after one failed attempt. Humanity would need to be ready for what was coming. 3 days later, they were rescued by a human patrol ship. The captain was amazed to find survivors from Epsilon Station, especially after the massive explosion had been detected across half the sector. Jake's report of the events was immediately classified and sent to the highest levels of military command. Maya's research data proved invaluable to the scientists working on defensive measures against parasitic threats. Her cure was not perfect, but it was a start. More importantly, her understanding of how the parasites communicated led to the development of early warning systems that could detect alien infiltration attempts. Jake found himself promoted and transferred to a new assignment, leader of a special response team designed to handle exactly this kind of threat. The military had decided that his actions on Epsilon Station proved he had the right kind of thinking for impossible situations. When Maya thanked him for not leaving her behind, Jake simply shrugged. "That's what humans do," he said. "We don't abandon each other." 6 months later, Jake visited Maya at her new research facility on the colony world of New Geneva. The facility was built like a fortress, with multiple layers of containment and security systems designed to prevent another Epsilon Station incident. Maya had learned from her mistakes and was determined not to repeat them. The early warning system detected 3 more parasite infiltration attempts last month, Maya told him as they walked through her laboratory. All of them were stopped before they could establish a foothold. "Good," Jake said. "But they'll keep trying. These aliens don't give up easily." "Neither do we," Maya replied. "And now we know what to look for." Jake nodded, but his mind was already on his next assignment. Reports were coming in from the outer colonies about strange disappearances and unusual behavior among isolated communities. The patterns were different from the Epsilon Station incident. But they had the same smell of alien interference. As Jake prepared to leave New Geneva, Maya handed him a small device that looked like a modified communicator. It's a portable version of the electromagnetic disruptor, she explained. More powerful than the ones we built on the station, and it won't break if you drop it. Jake clipped the device to his belt next to his sidearm and emergency supplies. It was good to know he had another tool for fighting the unknown threats waiting in the darkness between stars. Stay safe out there, Maya said. You too, Jake replied. And keep working on that cure. Something tells me we're going to need it. As his transport ship lifted off from New Geneva, Jake looked out at the stars and thought about Captain Morrison's final words. The aliens thought human loyalty was a weakness, something to be exploited, but they were wrong. It was humanity's greatest strength, the thing that would keep them fighting no matter how dark things got. Jake smiled grimly and settled back in his seat. Let the aliens come. Humanity would be ready for them.